I still remember the first time I read about the Great Famine of 1315. The numbers alone were sterile on paper: 2 years of endless rain, fields drowned, cattle dying by the millions. But when I tried to imagine the air, the smell, the silence of hunger that spread across northern Europe, the history stopped being distant. It became a sound. The squelch of boots in mud, the hush of a world waiting for something to grow and nothing coming. By that spring, the sky had become an enemy. Rain started in April and did not stop until the next year's harvest was already lost. The peasants of England, France, and Flanders watched their fields dissolve into brown lakes. Wheat heads turned black before ripening. Rye and barley rotted where they stood. What had once been the geometry of order, rows of crops, boundaries of hedges, became chaos. A medieval farmer planted 2 seeds and harvested 2 back, one to eat, one to save for planting next year. In good years, he would get 7 for every one he buried. Modern agriculture gives us 30. But in 1315, the ratio fell to 1 to 1. Civilization had no margin left. Then came the second blow, a sickness with no name. It began, they said, with the cattle coughing blood in the east, somewhere near the Black Sea. Within months, it reached the Atlantic. Between 1315 and 1319, 60 to 80% of Europe's livestock were gone. In England alone, 62% of herds perished. When a cow died, it wasn't just meat that disappeared. It was milk for children, butter for trade, hides for shoes, and manure for fields. The chain of life broke link by link until the only thing left was mud and bone. Chronicles from that time read like fever dreams. King Edward II, the richest man in England, arrived at St. Albans Abbey and found no bread to eat. In villages, people turned on horses, then dogs, then on each other. 3 million died, 10, maybe 15% of all northern Europe. And in that apocalypse, the forest began to whisper something to the survivors. Look down. Underfoot, among the wet leaves, lay millions of acorns. Most people today would call them yard waste, something to sweep, burn, or ignore. But for those who had nothing, the forest floor became a supermarket. The irony still strikes me every time I pick one up. The same nut we crush under our shoes once decided who would live and who would die. Archaeologists have found that in Iron Age settlements across Europe, acorns weren't just famine food, they were a planned reserve. At one site, 3 entire granaries were found, filled with stored acorns, their charred shells frozen in time. Out of 20 ceramic vessels examined from Neolithic layers, 18 still carried microscopic starch granules, acorn starch. These were not improvisations, they were systems, ancient kitchens designed for a food most of us can't even imagine eating today. The Greeks ate them. Pliny the Elder wrote of Romans grinding them into flour when grain ran short. 1,000 years later, during the Norman conquest of southern Italy, desperate peasants were recorded stealing acorns from pigs to make bread. In one chronicle, a monk wrote simply, "They ate what the forest gave," and called it mercy. I imagine that moment the sound of an acorn cracking open between 2 stones, the first hiss as it hits boiling water. It wasn't culinary curiosity, it was survival engineering. If you look closely, history hides blueprints. This one begins in desperation and ends in chemistry. The oak tree, through the eyes of a medieval peasant, was not a symbol of strength or shade, it was infrastructure, food storage, fuel, shelter, medicine, every part of it mattered. But the acorn, that small, bitter fruit of endurance, was the core of the system. Today, I walk through forests where no one even knows which oaks are red and which are white. We name streets after them, but we can't tell their bark apart. We call ourselves advanced. Yet we would starve surrounded by abundance. In 1315, people couldn't afford that kind of ignorance. They listened to trees the way we listen to weather forecasts. A forest of oaks meant calories waiting for release, if only one knew how to unlock them. Because acorns are not a gift, they are a test. Inside every one lies both food and poison, and the line between them is knowledge. That's what fascinates me most about the story of the acorn. It's not just about hunger or hardship. It's about information about chemistry hidden inside folklore, about data stored in memory instead of books. When I hold an acorn today, I don't see waste. I see design. Nature's sealed container of carbohydrates, oils, and proteins, waiting to be disarmed by human patience. The medieval peasants who learned that secret didn't have laboratories or thermometers, only observation and necessity. And yet, in their silence, they discovered a process modern chemists would later define with equations. The Great Famine ended in 1322, but its lessons buried themselves deeper than any root. Every acorn that fell afterward carried the memory of those 7 years of rain. It whispered to the next generation, prepare, learn, endure. And maybe that's why, 7 centuries later, I find myself crouching in a forest with mud on my hands, turning a single acorn over in my palm and wondering, if our supermarkets vanished tomorrow, how much of that old intelligence still lives in us? When I first stepped into a real oak forest to test the old methods, I finally understood what those medieval foragers had seen. Not a quiet grove of trees, but a living archive. Each trunk was a page, each leaf a clue, and every acorn on the ground was a question of life or death. Back in the 14th century, there were no botany books, no labeled specimens, no diagrams of leaf venation or bark texture. Yet a peasant could identify an oak species from 100 yards away. He had to, the difference meant survival. There were 2 main families, the red oaks, whose acorns were thick with tannins, and the white oaks, which carried a gentler sweetness. A mistake could mean days of wasted labor or an entire batch of flour that would turn a stomach into a knot of pain. So the forest became a teacher. Bark that felt rough and deeply furrowed under the fingers, red oak, bitter. Bark that ran smoother, with gray scales like fish skin, white oak, the one worth gathering. They read the leaves too. Broad lobes with pointed tips like claws signaled danger. Rounded lobes promised safety. A trained eye could scan a distant canopy and read an invisible map of edibility. Autumn was their harvest season, September through October, when the air turned metallic and the days carried that faint scent of wood smoke and damp soil. If you were alive then, you would have heard the sound of acorns hitting the forest floor like rain, soft, rhythmic, endless. Each one was a calorie, a fragment of hope. The rules of foraging were strict, passed down orally, memorized by children before they could read a prayer. Rule 1. No caps. If the little hat was still attached, the nut inside was too young, not yet formed. Rule 2. No cracks. Even a hairline fracture could invite mold that would spread through a winter's storage like invisible fire. Rule 3. No holes. The neat, perfect circles bored by the acorn weevil proof that a larva had eaten the heart out of the nut. What remained was just a shell. A medieval woman would test them by sound. She'd shake one near her ear, a good acorn gave a solid thud. A hollow one rattled faintly. It was a kind of acoustic engineering, the simplest possible quality control. But collecting them was no romantic walk in the woods. It was labor measured in miles and aches. To feed a family through a single winter required not a few handfuls, but sacks upon sacks, hundreds of pounds. People worked bent at the waist for hours, fingers numb from cold, backs screaming, and all the while, the forest competed with them. Squirrels, deer, boar, the same ancient rivals, all chasing the same currency of survival. That's why villages organized foraging parties. Families moved through the woods together like small armies. The children darted between roots to snatch the fallen nuts. The elders carried baskets woven from reeds, and someone always kept watch for wolves. The harvest was a race, and every acorn gathered before the first frost could mean one more day alive in February. When they returned from the forest, their work still wasn't done. The acorns were spread across woven mats near the hearth to dry. Weeks of slow heat would make their shells brittle and the nut meat firm, essential for the grinding and leaching to come. But first came the test, the simplest and most brilliant of all, the float test. I filled a clay bowl with water the way they did and poured my own harvest in. The surface rippled with pale brown circles. Some sank instantly. Others bobbed to the top. That's the secret. Good acorns sink, bad ones float. A weevil-eaten nut is full of air pockets, lighter than water. The villagers would skim them off with wooden spoons, discarding failure before it could spread. It was so simple and so perfect. No chemistry, no instruments, just physics and patience. I watched the water darken as the acorns soaked, tiny bubbles rising like breath. The sound was soft, almost alive. And I realized this was not primitive ignorance. This was precision tuned through centuries of repetition. Each test, each habit, had been paid for with someone's hunger once. At night, after the forest harvests, the peasants would sit by their fires, clothes steaming dry, the smell of smoke mixed with tannin-heavy air. The baskets of acorns would rest nearby, and the family would whisper about the coming winter. There was no guarantee. Only the quiet confidence that if they had gathered enough, and if they processed them right, they might endure. As I sat there, in my own century, watching the last light filter through oak leaves, I felt a kind of reverence, not for the trees themselves, but for the minds that had learned to read them. We imagine progress as a straight line, but standing in that forest I saw how knowledge moves in circles. The same truths rediscovered, forgotten, rediscovered again. To a medieval peasant, the oak was a textbook written in living wood, and each autumn page had to be read before winter came to erase it. I tried it once, the way they must have done, no machines, no shortcuts, just a flat stone and a rounded hammerstone, the most ancient tools in human hands. The first strike startled me. The shell didn't crack so much as pop, a dry, fibrous sound like brittle bone snapping. Beneath it, a pale nut meat showed itself, damp and fragile, already staining my fingers with a faint brown sheen. Now imagine doing that hundreds of times. In the Middle Ages, this was not a task for an hour but for entire evenings. I picture a family gathered around the hearth, children with tiny hands prying open the easier ones, mothers scraping away the thin papery skins that clung to the meat, fathers tapping methodically, rhythm echoing through the wooden beams of the house. There were no clocks, the rhythm of work was measured by sound and fatigue. Each acorn demanded judgment. Hit too soft, and the shell held. Hit too hard, and you crushed the flesh to dust. It took practice to know the exact weight of the blow. The peasants might not have called it torque or pressure, but they understood calibration better than most engineers today. The smell of tannin filled the air, sharp and bitter like overbrewed tea. It stained everything it touched, fingers, nails, even the grain of the stone. The work was repetitive, hypnotic, but repetition has its own kind of dignity. Somewhere between the 10th and the 100th nut, you stop thinking about the end result. You just fall into rhythm. By the light of the fire, faces glowed with amber reflections. The youngest children picked away the brown inner skins the tester, while the older ones sorted fragments into bowls. The family worked as a living machine, a hand-powered factory born from hunger. But there was something profoundly human about it. Conversation carried between cracks of stone, laughter under fatigue, the low hum of shared endurance. In modern kitchens, we use devices that whir and pulse and finish the same task in seconds. But speed erases intimacy. In the old way, each acorn passed through human touch dozens of times before becoming food. That intimacy created memory. The hands remembered, even when words didn't. After hours of work, the bowl of shelled acorns looked almost luxurious, smooth, pale, slightly glossy under the firelight. But to eat one now would have been suicide. The real enemy was invisible, dissolved deep inside. Tannins, the tree's chemical armor. In raw form, they bind to proteins in the body, blocking digestion and poisoning the liver. The acorn, for all its beauty, still wanted you dead. And so the people adapted. They discovered that to transform it, they had to disassemble not just the shell, but the molecule. Before that alchemy could begin, though, the nuts had to be broken smaller gravel-sized pieces to expose more surface to water. The same stones that cracked the shells now became blades of a sort, pounding, crushing, fragmenting. Dust rose, light brown and oily. Each blow left a faint vibration in the wrist and a deeper fatigue in the shoulders. When I did it myself, I thought of those long winter nights. My breath formed clouds in the cold air of my workshop, and the smell, that deep, earthy bitterness, was everywhere. The sound of stone against stone was meditative, almost sacred. I began to understand that this was not just food preparation, it was ritual. I thought about how many calories they were actually unlocking. 1 kilogram of acorns held around 4,000 kilocalories, enough to feed a man for 2 days if his stomach could handle the tannins. But the process to make it edible burned nearly as much energy as it produced. It only made sense in one context: survival, where efficiency was irrelevant and persistence was everything. By the end of the night, my hands ached the way theirs must have, small cuts from shells, fingertips roughened, skin darkened by tannin, until it looked like walnut wood. The bowl before me was full of broken fragments, each one carrying the memory of touch. I realized then that every meal in the past was earned in the purest sense. When the grinding finally stopped, the village would fall silent. Outside, frost would have begun to creep across the fields. The people knew that by morning, the real chemistry would begin, the long process of washing out bitterness, drop by drop, hour by hour. They didn't call it leaching, they just called it work. And when the last ember dimmed, the family would stretch their hands toward the fire, whisper good night, and let the smell of oak smoke mix with the metallic scent of acorn skins. Somewhere beyond the forest, wolves howled. Inside, the nuts waited, hard, bitter, and full of promise. At dawn, the real transformation began. I remember pouring the first handful of crushed acorns into a clay pot of boiling water and watching the color shift almost instantly: pale amber, then brown, then the deep near black of old tea. That was the poison leaving. Every swirl in that water was tannin escaping, the acorn surrendering its bitterness molecule by molecule. Medieval peasants didn't have words like polyphenol or hydrolysis, but they knew, with the precision of scientists, that water could disarm the oak's defenses. They understood that temperature mattered, that patience mattered. They had 2 methods, each carrying its own philosophy. Cold leaching was slow, deliberate. The acorns soaked in buckets of cold water for days, sometimes a week, with the water changed several times a day. The result preserved every bit of natural oil and starch, producing a flour that thickened into porridge when cooked. Cold leaching was for those who had time to wait, a luxury in an age where hunger rarely waited for anyone. Hot leaching was urgency distilled. The water boiled in iron or ceramic pots over open fire, bubbles snapping with the rhythm of survival. Each batch took 20 minutes before the liquid grew dark and had to be replaced with fresh water. The first pour was toxic enough to kill livestock. They knew never to feed it to pigs or dogs. I could almost smell it, sharp, acidic, like wet bark after lightning. The second boil was lighter, the third lighter still. By the fourth, the water turned a faint straw yellow. The acorn, at last, began to lose its bitterness. But there was a secret trick that the elders whispered, one that turned this repetitive task into chemistry centuries ahead of its time: ash. A handful of wood ash stirred into the boiling water, not much, perhaps 2 cups to a pot, transformed the whole equation. I tried it. The water hissed as the ash hit the surface, forming a cloudy gray suspension. What the peasants could not have known by name, they knew by instinct. Ash is alkaline. When it met the tannic acid, a reaction occurred. The bitterness didn't just wash away, It broke apart, neutralized. What might have taken 6 changes of water now took 3. The first medieval chemists were not alchemists in towers, but mothers stirring ash into boiling pots to feed their families. The smell shifted subtly after that, less of bitterness, more of roasted wood. I stirred with a wooden spoon, my reflection trembling in the dark surface. Somewhere in that black mirror of water, I could see the outlines of their faces, tired, hollow-eyed, but patient. People who had learned through famine that precision was not a luxury, but a form of faith. When the boiling ended, they strained the acorns through woven cloth or perforated ceramic lids, careful not to lose even a single piece. They rinsed them again with clean water to remove any ash residue. Then came the test, the same one still used today. Take a small fragment, rinse it, and chew. If bitterness remains, you start again. If the taste is mild, nutty, with a hint of sweetness, the process is complete. I did that test myself. The first piece was still harsh, like black tea boiled too long. The second batch, better. By the third, it was different, earthy, almost like chestnut, faintly sweet at the edges. The bitterness was gone. It felt like a small miracle achieved by patience and repetition. For them, that first safe bite was victory. After days of hunger and labor, after gathering, sorting, cracking, and boiling, this was the moment that separated poison from nourishment. A single taste told them they had survived another week. But even more than survival, there was knowledge encoded here. Long before chemical equations, these people practiced controlled reactions. They understood that once you began with cold water, you could not switch to hot, or you'd lock the tannins permanently inside. They learned that through failure, each ruined batch a chemical experiment gone wrong. And they remembered. That's how a civilization teaches itself chemistry without ever writing a formula. As I stood over my own pot, watching the last steam curl into the morning air, I realized that this was as much an act of respect as of curiosity. The water in the pot was not just extracting toxins, it was carrying away arrogance, the modern illusion that knowledge only begins with microscopes and laboratories. For the medieval peasant, the forest was a laboratory, the pot a beaker, the fire a constant heat source calibrated by instinct. Every sense, smell, sight, taste, sound, was a measuring instrument. When the process was done, they would spread the now safe acorns on cloth to dry again, the air around them filled with that soft scent of warm wood and damp stone. Somewhere nearby, a child might have tasted the first piece and smiled, too young to know the chemistry but old enough to know relief. That's the moment I imagine most vividly. A quiet, smoky room, someone exhaling and whispering, "It's good now." In that small declaration, the famine receded for one more night. Knowledge had triumphed again, not with grand invention, but with persistence and faith in the logic of nature. By the time the leaching ended, the acorns had lost their bitterness, but also their flavor, soft, pale, and waterlogged, as if waiting for rebirth. The peasants knew what to do next. Fire was their final tool, and with it, they gave these humble fragments of oak seed both taste and soul. I spread my own batch on the edge of a wood fire, just as they would have done. The embers glowed red under a thin layer of ash, their heat dry and even. This was not cooking as we know it today, no pans, no grids, no precision temperatures, just intuition. They waited until the flames died down, raked aside a small patch of glowing coals, and laid the acorn pieces directly into the hot ash. The sound was quiet but alive, like the sighing of old wood remembering its tree. The transformation began almost instantly. Steam hissed from the wet kernels, and a soft, nutty aroma rose through the smoke. The gray ash darkened, and the color of the acorns deepened from pale beige to golden brown, then to the warm, earthy tone of walnut. 10 minutes in, the smell had changed, no longer raw or tannic, but rich, almost sweet, somewhere between chestnut and coffee. I turned them with a stick, just as they must have, listening to the faint pops as the moisture fled their cores. This was the simplest chemistry of all: water to vapor, starch to sugar, bitterness to nourishment. And standing there, feeling the heat on my face, I thought, this is the moment when survival finally begins to taste good. When they were done, I brushed away the ash, let them cool in my hands, and bit one in half. It cracked with a dry, brittle snap, releasing a smoky perfume that clung to the fingers. The taste stunned me, nutty, faintly sweet, with a depth that no modern snack has. There was no trace of bitterness left. If someone handed this to me in a farmer's market today, I would call it artisanal. 700 years ago, it was the difference between life and death. But roasted acorns were only one destination. The real treasure was the flour, the one that could be stored, traded, or baked into bread. To make it, they ground the roasted nuts between stones, working for hours to produce a single bowl of coarse brown powder. I tried it. The motion was exhausting, stone against stone, wrist turning, shoulders tightening. The acorns resisted, their oiliness binding the meal into clumps. Each minute was an act of slow defiance. By the time the flour formed, the scent was deep and heavy, an earthy mixture of smoke and sweetness. This was not the snow-white flour of modern wheat. It was darker, alive, slightly damp from its own natural oils. In famine years, it was often mixed with whatever else could be found: barley, millet, even grass seed, and baked into dense, flat loaves. But pure acorn bread, when it was possible, was something rare, a flavor of resilience. I mixed some of my own flour with water, kneaded it into a thick paste, and pressed it flat onto a stone warmed by the fire. Within minutes, the surface blistered and browned, and a smell filled the air that I can only describe as ancient comfort. When I tore a piece and tasted it, I finally understood why people had remembered this food for centuries. It was heavy, yes, gritty and dense, but also strangely satisfying, a taste that seemed to anchor you to the earth itself. The medieval families must have eaten it slowly, not because of etiquette, but because each bite carried the weight of hours. 5 hours of labor for one meal that was the exchange rate of survival. A single day's food for a family might mean 2 days of gathering, 3 of processing, 1 of boiling, and another of grinding. Every crumb represented time converted into calories by hand and fire. It's easy, from the comfort of a modern kitchen, to call that inefficient. But inefficiency assumes you have alternatives. They didn't. In a world collapsing under rain and disease, the arithmetic changed. Labor was not wasted. It was the only currency that could buy life. As I ate the last of the flatbread, I realized something humbling. The acorn had never been just food. It was proof of control of humans taking what nature gave and turning it from danger into nourishment. It was an act of resistance, not consumption. I imagine the scene centuries ago: a small stone cottage, smoke curling through the thatch roof, a mother slicing a hard brown loaf with a dull knife. Outside, the wind howls and snow gathers at the door. Inside, 5 people share one meal that took an entire week to earn, and yet they eat it with reverence, because this bread is more than calories. It's knowledge turned edible. When I looked down at the crumbs on my own hands, I thought of them, of every nameless man, woman, and child who stood in the same smoky light, their stomachs full for another night because someone, long ago, figured out how to make the forest yield its secrets. If the story of the acorn had ended at survival, it would already have been enough, a tale of endurance carved from hunger and rain. But history has a strange sense of irony. The same food once cursed as a mark of poverty would, within a few centuries, find itself reborn on the polished tables of European nobility. It began quietly, in the 15th century, when physicians and scholars, the learned men of their day, began to speak of the acorn in a different tone. Medical texts from Italy and France praised its restorative properties, claiming that acorns from the largest oak trees could strengthen the stomach, calm fevers, and even purify the blood. What had once been the food of desperation became a medicinal curiosity. And as so often happens, where medicine led, cuisine followed. In Renaissance kitchens, curiosity was the seed of fashion. Recipes began to appear complex, indulgent, completely divorced from their origins in famine. I once read one from Naples, recorded in the late 1400s. It began with the same steps the peasants had perfected centuries before: gather acorns, leach out their bitterness, and parboil them in salted water. But then came the transformation. The softened nuts were ground into paste, mixed with butter, milk, cream, and grated aged cheese. Sugar and cinnamon followed, then egg yolks, then a final glaze of rosewater. The dish was called a torta di ghiande, an acorn pie. I tried to imagine it. The glow of a noble kitchen, copper pots gleaming, servants stirring acorn paste into velvet smoothness while outside, in the same hills, peasants still gathered the bitter nuts just to stay alive. The air smelled of cinnamon and wealth. The same ingredient that once carried the taste of survival now carried the fragrance of privilege. They even had a name for it in the Latin cookbooks: cibus artificialiter nobilitatis, food artificially ennobled. It meant that through art, labor, and luxury, something humble could be made worthy of a noble palate. I can almost hear the irony echo through time. What had once been eaten beside smoky fires under leaking roofs now shimmered beneath chandeliers. But beneath the sugar and spice, the acorn remained the same. The same bitter seed, the same chemistry of tannins, the same knowledge required to tame it. What changed was perception, not the food, but the story told about it. That, perhaps, is the greatest transformation of all, not from poison to nourishment, but from shame to pride. When I first read those Renaissance recipes, I felt both admiration and discomfort. Admiration for the craft, the precise ratios, the intuitive chemistry, the sheer beauty of a dessert built from hardship. Discomfort for what it revealed about us. Because even now, 700 years later, we still repeat that pattern. We elevate what was once necessity into luxury and forget the hands that first made it possible. Today, in modern farmers' markets and experimental kitchens, acorn flour is returning. It's sold as a gluten-free alternative, wrapped in neat paper bags, often marketed as ancient superfood. I've seen people pay 10 times the price of wheat flour for something their ancestors once gathered from the forest floor in despair. We call it rediscovery, but it's really remembrance in disguise. When I roasted my last handful of acorns, I thought about that paradox. The same nut that once meant survival now sits on gourmet menus, its history scrubbed clean of hunger. But maybe there's something redemptive in that cycle, a way for the humble to rise again, not as fashion, but as a reminder. The oak never cared who ate its fruit, it only asked to be understood. And perhaps that's what ties us to those forgotten peasants more than anything. The act of learning, of patience, of turning the world's indifference into sustenance. As the last of the roasted pieces cooled on my table, their color deep and golden under the afternoon light, I realized that the acorn's journey mirrored our own. What begins in struggle often ends in refinement. But if we forget where it began, we lose the very flavor that made it worth tasting. I stood beneath an oak tree as the last light of evening slid through its branches, the ground scattered with 1,000 acorns. Each one glinted softly in the dim light, like tiny relics of survival. When I bent to pick one up, it was cold, smooth, heavier than it looked, as if it carried a secret weight. I rolled it between my palms and realized that for nearly 7,000 years, people had done this exact same gesture. The acorn has outlived empires, kings, and inventions. It remembers us even when we forget it. Archaeologists have uncovered the proof. In Neolithic settlements, they found specialized pottery still dusted with acorn starch, the ghost of a meal older than writing itself. Iron Age granaries filled with charred acorns show that this was not an accident of famine but a planned strategy, humanity's insurance policy against failure. For every age that thought itself secure, The oak waited patiently to remind it otherwise. I imagine those long cycles, the rhythm of rain and hunger, abundance and ruin, and how knowledge was passed along not through books, but through calloused hands and shared work. A mother teaching her daughter to tell a good nut from a bad one by sound. A grandfather showing a boy how to stir ash into boiling water until the bitterness dies. Every generation inscribing the same lesson. Survival is not invention, it's memory. When I look at modern civilization, I sometimes wonder what memories we've traded away for comfort. We have machines that can grow food faster than any field hand ever dreamed. Yet, if the power goes out for a week, entire cities panic. We call our progress efficiency, but maybe it's just distance from the patience and intimacy that once defined living. The medieval peasants understood something we no longer teach, that the earth is both generous and guarded, and that its gifts must be negotiated, not demanded. They didn't romanticize hardship, they endured it. Their knowledge was practical, repetitive, hard-earned. But within that labor lay a kind of reverence. We've forgotten the humility of earning your meal from the elements, not purchasing it from a shelf. When the Great Famine ended in 1322, after 7 relentless years, Europe's population began to recover. But the memory of those bitter winters lingered like a scar. It shaped the culture of caution that would define generations, the belief that every surplus must be stored, every field respected, every seed guarded. The acorn became more than food. It was a symbol of endurance. I looked again at the acorn in my hand. Its cap was still attached, meaning it wasn't ready, the same rule medieval foragers had taught their children. I could almost hear their voices in the rustle of the leaves. Not yet. Wait. Patience makes it safe. I thought about how that rule, simple as it was, mirrored everything they believed, that time and care could turn danger into nourishment, that patience was a form of wisdom, and that the line between poison and food was often nothing more than attention. The oak stood silent, its trunk wide enough to remember centuries. I placed the acorn back at its roots. Above me, the canopy shifted, and for a brief moment, the sun caught on the bark like burnished iron. I realized that every tree here was a monument not to kings or battles, but to anonymous people who listened, learned, and endured. History isn't just the grand stories carved in stone. It's also the quiet knowledge encoded in acts of survival, the boiling of bitter nuts, the patience of waiting for the water to clear, the first sweet taste after days of work. When I finally walked away, my hand still smelled faintly of smoke and tannin, that deep, earthy perfume that lingers long after the fire is gone. I thought of those who came before me, who lived harder lives, but knew the world more deeply, and I felt something between gratitude and grief. Because the truth is, we haven't lost their techniques. They're still here, underfoot, waiting. Every acorn on the ground is a forgotten textbook of resilience, its lessons written not in ink, but in bitterness and time. And when I roasted my final handful that night, the aroma filled the air again, nutty, warm, alive. I tasted one, and it was everything I imagined. Smoky, earthy, quietly triumphant. These roasted acorns taste like history. And history, I realized, tastes better than we remember.